You know that moment when you're sitting next to someone and everything feels fine on the surface. You're talking, maybe even laughing, but somewhere underneath that, something feels slightly off. Not wrong enough to name, just unclear. And the strange part is, the more you try to understand what you feel, the harder it becomes to describe it. It's like your emotions are speaking in a language you almost understand, but not quite. Some people call this overthinking, others call it insecurity. But people who experience this know it doesn't feel that simple. Because it's not just confusion, it's a kind of emotional static, where closeness and distance seem to exist at the same time, and you can't tell which one is real. There's a quiet pattern some people fall into in relationships, where they feel deeply connected and strangely disconnected, often within the same moment. They might care about someone, miss them when they're gone, think about them constantly, but when they're actually together, something feels slightly misaligned, and that misalignment is hard to explain, so it often gets ignored, or pushed aside, or quietly blamed on something else. But emotional confusion isn't random. It's not a personality flaw. It's usually a signal that the mind is trying to process two conflicting emotional realities at once. On one side, there's attachment, familiarity, the comfort of connection, and on the other side, there's uncertainty, unmet needs, subtle emotional gaps that are felt but not always acknowledged. The brain doesn't like holding contradictions, so it tries to resolve them. But when it can't, it creates confusion instead. And that confusion often shows up in very small, almost invisible ways. Some people find themselves rereading old messages, trying to feel something they can't quite access anymore. Others notice that they feel more connected when the person isn't around, but less certain when they are. Sometimes they even hesitate before replying, not because they don't care, but because they don't fully understand what they're feeling in that moment. These are the kinds of behaviors people rarely talk about, but they happen more often than most realize. And they don't mean something is broken. They usually mean something deeper is unresolved. There's an idea that's been quietly explored in psychology for years, something even thinkers like Carl Jung hinted at in different ways. The idea that when two emotional truths exist at once, the mind doesn't choose one. It holds both, and that tension creates confusion. Because part of you might genuinely care, while another part of you feels unseen or emotionally out of sync. And instead of clearly feeling one or the other, you feel both at the same time. That's where emotional confusion begins. Not in the absence of feeling, but in the presence of too many conflicting ones. This often has roots that go much further back than the relationship itself. Sometimes it comes from environments where emotional signals were inconsistent, where closeness didn't always feel safe, or where affection was present but not always stable. So the brain learns something very specific. That connection can feel good and uncertain at the same time. And over time, that pattern becomes familiar, not comfortable, just familiar. So when a similar dynamic appears in relationships later on, the mind doesn't immediately recognize it as a problem. It recognizes it as something it already understands. And that's where things become quietly complicated. Because emotional confusion doesn't feel like danger. It feels like something you've felt before, which makes it easier to stay in, even when it doesn't fully make sense. Some people even notice that they create small tests without realizing it. They might pull away slightly, just to see if the other person notices. Or they might overanalyze simple interactions, searching for hidden meaning. Not because they want drama, but because they're trying to resolve something internal, something that doesn't have clear answers. If you've ever noticed yourself doing this, you're definitely not alone. And if you enjoy exploring these quiet patterns of human psychology, subscribing to the channel helps more people discover these insights. There's another layer to this that's often overlooked. Emotional confusion isn't just about uncertainty. It's also about awareness. Because people who experience this tend to be highly attuned to emotional shifts. They notice small changes, subtle tones, tiny differences in behavior, things most people would ignore. But that awareness comes with a cost. When you notice everything, it becomes harder to feel certain about anything, because every moment carries multiple interpretations, and the mind keeps moving between them, trying to find the right one. But there isn't always a single correct interpretation, and that's what makes the confusion persist. There's also a quiet paradox here. The same sensitivity that creates confusion is also what allows for deep emotional understanding, the ability to read between the lines, to sense what isn't being said, to feel the emotional atmosphere of a relationship. That's not a weakness. It's a form of perception. But like any form of perception, it can become overwhelming without clarity. Some people cope with this by distancing themselves emotionally, not completely, just enough to reduce the noise. Others stay fully present, but constantly question what they feel, Neither response is right or wrong. They're just different ways the mind tries to protect itself from uncertainty. Modern behavioral research, even ideas explored in Thinking, Fast and Slow, suggests that when the brain encounters ambiguity, it often fills in gaps with assumptions. And those assumptions aren't always accurate, but they feel real because they come from past experiences. So what feels like confusion in the present is often shaped by patterns from the past. And that doesn't mean those patterns are permanent. It just means they're familiar. The final layer of this is something many people don't expect. Emotional confusion can sometimes be a quiet form of honesty, because instead of forcing a clear answer, the mind is acknowledging that something doesn't fully align, even if it can't explain why. And that awareness, even when it feels uncomfortable, is still a kind of clarity, just not the kind most people are used to. Because clarity is often imagined as certainty, but sometimes clarity is simply recognizing that something feels unresolved and allowing that to exist without rushing to fix it. So if you've ever found yourself feeling both close and distant at the same time, or caring deeply while quietly questioning everything, it doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means your mind is trying to process complexity in a way that makes sense to it. There are many quiet patterns like this hidden inside human behavior, and sometimes the ones that feel the most confusing are the ones that reveal the most about how we actually experience connection. If this resonated with you, there may be other parts of your emotional world worth exploring.